So we'll get straight to the topics that we have today. But before going to the specific part of the discussions, let me, at the first instance, give a short framework of the area within which we are and how we are going to proceed. It's not my intention to say that, growth has not been a challenge. Growth, either a positive figure or a negative figure in terms of quantum, have always been a challenge. Whether it is 5, 6, 7 plus, or whether it is 0 and still negative, it has always been a challenge and have been subject of extensive debate. We're not going to go to that part of the discussions, but would specifically go to what has been the challenges when we come to finance. Finance and development have got a linkage, of course, a great linkage. They have been subject of academic discussions, of reviews and studies, but this debate will continue. To what extent finance will contribute to growth? And the question of when it comes to growth, we will find historically that, we have partners, not only as, those who are intermediating, but also we have governments. And historically, the role of finance have been recognized. And if we go to the 80s and 90s, you'll find suddenly that, we have had some form of policy which was like structural and policy reforms guided more at, abolition of prices, opening of the market, decontrols, reducing government interventions. So we'll sometime hear one of our colleagues will talk about governance. And the second generation of the reform focused on, structural and institutional type of reform to say how more efficient institutions should be so that we can deliver still on growth. And currently now we are in a situation we see how we are better able to do business using private leverage financing. Doing business also means how the environment changes. But still the question of growth and benefits of growth, we still ask the question, growth for whom? And how this growth benefits those who have contributed to that growth. We will have in society, in the case, those who contribute, and those, of course, who are the elderly, who would be out of that process. And the question of how inclusive also comes in.
I think the definition of financial inclusion is generally is agreed upon. It involves the delivery of financial services. Now when I say financial services, people think about banking, but we're talking about insurance, we're talking about health services, we're talking about all other services to the different parts of the society, and not only to the well-off, but to the poor, to the middle income, and to the rich alike. And also in terms of geographical terms, to the big city dwellers, to the remote rural villages, and to everybody. I'd like to personalize this issue of financial inclusion. I grew up in a village that's about 7,000, 8,000 people, and my father had a very small shop. And the nearest bank was 80 miles away. The nearest financial services was 80 miles away. So I remember my father bringing, a small cash and putting, under the mattress. And we sometimes, 7 boys, 8 boys, sometimes used to take a penny there, penny there. This is what. But I remember one day, my father brought, he was supposed to go to a big city to bring some more supplies for his own meager shop. But then the money he put under the mattress, most of it were actually eaten by rat. And I could feel the frustrations of my father. You have no safety net to go to. And when I grew up, went to business school, more specifically to banking, I look at that episode, and as I was a corporate banker, I said, perhaps corporate banking is not for me. I need to go maybe to something where I can deliver, knowing what my father went through. So I don't have to read financial inclusion from books. I personally have experienced. So that is the meaning of financial inclusion. in a sense. Now, let me come to the idea of the financial inclusion is a multi-stakeholders, should take a multi-stakeholders framework or approach. Now, it should take the public-private sector, civil societies, and when I say private, I mean technology companies, I mean insurance companies, I mean banks, I mean all sorts of banks, whether, commercial banks, microfinance banks, and everybody. And when I say public, I am also including that in multi-development financial institutions such as ours and the private sector. So it is a multi-sector, multi-stakeholders approach. That's the only way we could dent the huge demand that's out there. Let me perhaps go on and say, I work in a commercial bank, and if we say it is the responsibility of microfinance financial institutions to reach those people who need financial service, or the poor, I think that's the wrong idea. So we know the constraints. We know the implications of constraints. The question is, how do we, as multi-stakeholders, whether it's a private, public, civil society, development financial institutions, how do we, from the supply side, meet the demands of those who really need the services? I think that, to me, is a question that we should be addressing here, because the literature on the constraints in terms of high risk, poor people are high risk, which I really don't believe, because their revenue is high risk because of volatility and uncertainty and unpredictability of their revenue stream. That is what's high risk, not poor people per se, because their cash flow is very uneven, and that's what makes it. So high cost is another issue that's always a constraint. Regulatory environment, lack of awareness from, if you really don't know, if you don't know the features of financial products, it will be very difficult for you to choose what sort of product. You generally, and your neighbors, all your neighbors say, oh, for banking, oh, that's for the rich. That's for the well-off. It's not for you. So the government has responsibility to educate people. Banks have responsibility. Technology companies have got responsibility to come up and bridge the gap in technology. And banks have a responsibility to pool their resources in terms of reaching those people. So I think the challenge for us today is to ask, where do we go from here? How could we reach those people? And I'm going to leave it at that for the time being.
So that actually put or led to a shift in paradigm from we are seeing actually a move from the credit-led financial inclusion policies that were supported during the 80s and the 90s, including in Africa, to more payment-led credit inclusion, financial inclusion policies. Obviously, there are challenges to achieve financial inclusion. You know that 2/3 of the adult population in developing countries lack proper access to formal financial services like checking or saving accounts, and the largest share of unbanked live in sub-Saharan Africa. These challenges could be actually grouped into three categories. You have challenges related to supply, demand, and then the environment. And Mohammed touched on this earlier. On the supply side, and I will focus on Africa because it's a region that I'm familiar with. Most of the financial systems in Africa are small, And this actually prevents the achievement of economies of scale and increases barriers at entry. This leads to problems of concentration, lack of competition. So banks and other financial institutions do not see the need to go down market. Basically, they can be very profitable by doing business with the large corporates. So there's no actually commercial interest for them to serve these financially excluded, those underserved groups. There's also another problem because, again, it's not only a matter of access. In Africa, there is a problem also of maturity for firms, because financial inclusion is about household, but it's also about firms. 60% of loans provided in Africa have a maturity of less than 1 year. There is challenges to provide long-term financing for investment purposes. So you know that there's very little long-term saving products in Africa. Potential source of long-term finance like pension funds are doing what we call reverse maturity. And they're investing actually their long-term resources into money market instruments. So this is also a challenge, and we need the change in the way these institutions operate. We need to unlock the potential long-term resources to improve the maturity of actually lending in Africa. So from the supply side, competition, concentration, lack of competition, the small size, lack of diversification. Banks dominate financial systems. You have very little non-bank financial institutions like leasing, which could be really appropriate to fund the SMEs, because they would not ask or their collateral requirement would be much smaller. Then one would ask why these kind of institutions are not developed, and this link it to the environment. Again, the inappropriate regulatory frameworks, the inefficient judicial systems. If you are operating in the leasing sector, you want to have an efficient asset repossession system, ideally out of court, because you don't spend 2 years waiting to recover the asset. So all these inefficiencies in the infrastructure, in the regulatory and the judicial systems lead actually to problems to improve financial inclusion. And of course, we have also demand-side constraints, low literacy rates, very little capacities from African enterprises and households. Now we see more and more financial literacy programs and initiatives, and that's also something that has been overlooked for a while. I think demand constraints are as important as the supply side, because it's very nice to provide funding, but as long as the person who is receiving it does not know how to use the money and doesn't understand the features of the project, as Mohammed highlighted, there will be no financial inclusion.
To look, as Thuraya has said, that it is beyond access. So the measurement should really capture this aspect of getting beyond the access to banking, but also on the demand and the supply side. Now, of course, on this financial inclusion, what I can tell that there are a lot of work. It is now called microcredit revolution, and there are some coalitions around the world working on this type of issues regarding measurement, regarding definitions. And I can cite one of them, which is the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, which has its own website. I did my own search on it. And you can find a series of indicators that will really help the practitioners and the developers, to have the right indicators to measure the issues of financial inclusion in a country, in a region. So you have something like account penetration, which is measuring, how the banking penetration is and how many adults have access or not access to banks. The other type of indicators that measures the access is also, or non-access, is what are the barriers to have formal account ownership in the banking system, and how and why are these bank accounts or others are used and for what purpose. So this kind of picture will help you and will help also policymakers and practitioners to take the right decisions. Now, coming back to the issue of constraints, I mean, the enabling environment is crucial to help financial inclusion. But, I mean, among them is the macroeconomic settings. And I need to mention also that if we consider the banking system as a public good, then the availability of banking to everybody, to payment services, should be without discrimination to everybody. So we need to understand all these barriers and to seek what are the appropriate measures to have, non-affordable services to the poor. And now we need to understand the reasons why. And that's why here we need to move from the classic approach to financial inclusion by probably looking to innovative ways of financial inclusion. And I'm citing one that it is now getting, an exponential, expansion, which is mobile money or mobile, payments. In Kenya, for example, where 60% of those who have mobiles have also made some payments or received transfers through the mobile. So we need to understand, we need to make research, and to be innovative in our way to think of this financial inclusion by being more inclusive. Banking, non-banking services. Of course, the role of the government, the role of the classic banks, are still there. They need to work together, the policymakers, etc. But I think that, in my point of view, as an evaluator, we need more now to assess what is the best way to increase the access and get beyond that. The rural population can get access to assets, but also build their own assets. Thank you.
Mostly everything we do is about inclusive finance in one way or another. We're bringing through our financial institution resources to projects, to initiatives, to policies where no finance is available. So we definitely believe that finance matters. Let me just step back then on just to restate what you know, again, which is what I was working here, about the role of a financial sector in the economy. Financial sector, as we know, right, plays a fundamental role in the economy by pooling resources, allocating these resources to the most efficient uses, facilitating payment so that things can be transferred from one hand to another, managing risk, smoothing out consumption patterns. Otherwise, many people would have peaks according to the moment in which they would have income. So the financial system is fundamental in the economic process. Without the financial system, development as we know it today would absolutely not take place. That's to start with. Development as we know it today could not take place if in the absence of a strong financial system. Therefore, the importance of financial inclusion, defined as broad access to a broad range of financial products, meaning products related to credit, products related to payments, products related to risk management, insurance products in particular, and products relating to related to saving. That's what we're talking about. Broad access to these type of products to the broadest part of the population. And if we put it this way, we realize that financial inclusion is not actually important because, as it's been stated in the title of this session, for equitable purposes, but for efficiency purposes. Without a financial inclusion, in the broad terms that we're saying here, the economic system could not work efficiently. So it's beyond equity. It's beyond equity. It's about efficiency of the economic system. And we're not talking about here indiscriminate access, as Soraya said it. We're talking about overcoming barriers to access to these type of services that are caused by institutional or by market imperfections. That's what we're talking about. Some projects and some people must naturally be excluded because they are not bankable projects. They will represent an inefficient use of our resources, of these pool resources. So it's not indiscriminate access. We're talking about efficient access to the majority of the population. And let me finish with one last point, and is that inclusion is just one part of an efficient and strong financial system. There are other two pillars fundamental for a good financial system to develop and grow. The other two pillars are stability and efficiency of the financial system. We must work in the three directions of efficiency, stability, and inclusion. When you disregard one of the three pillars, you run into problems. Precisely, this whole crisis that we've gone through is the result of an exuberant inclusion, right? Mortgages given to those who were not bankable, right? Exuberant exclusion against stability. That's precisely the case of not handling correctly the trade-offs between these three pillars. So going forward, important is then to have in mind the three pillars for a stable and strong financial system.
Thank you. I was first hesitating after Toraya's tilted the gender balance to tilt the linguistic balance, but I will speak in English to keep the conversation smooth, and I plead for indulgence from my Francophone colleagues.
Jean-Luc, there's one thing. You can speak your French in English.
I know. But I think the conversation is smoother than that. In preparing here, I was thinking I don't want to evade the question because I believe in the market powers to provide these solutions. But I was thinking of what is the role of the government and the state currently in this context. And it seems to me from the structural, from the contextual aspects as a government, that can be in my country, it can be in Africa, it can be wherever, there are two strong elements to take place. There are long-term structural objectives, issues, and there's the financial crisis. And both shape the way the government think about their role, the state thinks about their roles in the financial sector. On the long-term issues here in Africa, it seems to me that, and preceding colleagues have said, the story is positive, but it's unfinished. It's positive because the trends are positive. It's unfinished because some of the indicators were just recalled by either aggregate evidence or the personal stories. The indicators remain low. The shallowness of the sector, you said it yourself, Mr. Chairman, 30% of credit to the GDP roughly in the region, while it's 80% in the developing world. In my country, it's close to 200%. One adult out of four having a bank account, or less than one adult of having a bank account in Africa. So these indicators still point that there is a long-term structural road to go. It's going in the right directions, but perhaps with the exception of the stability pillar, which was raised from the previous sector, where Africa does actually quite well, perhaps too well. Perhaps there's too much capital and too much liquidity in the system. The other pillars, Africa lags behind. And then there's a financial crisis which has overhauled the whole regulation system. And again, I think in the way this global regulatory framework is being devised right now, there's been a system, that's my personal view, a system change in the sense that governments or states have taken the upper hand, while under Basel II, if I may say so, the agents had more of the upper hand. So in fact, regulation was under Basel II adapting to the systems of the financial institutions, whereas now it's a bit of the contrary, and I think it's a healthy development. We're going back to something more simple and easier to understand. So for governments to help these inclusiveness agenda, there are typically, we say, four dimensions which you look at. You look at the prudential and regulation and supervision, of course. And this is undisputed and more than ever. The role of the state there is important. But of course, it raises, going back to the Africa story, particular challenges, because we have talked of mobile banking and of all these innovative branchless banking, innovative solutions. They raise quite a few challenges in terms of prudential regulation and supervisory capacity. You essentially unbundle the system with this, you have multiplication of agent and you compound the principal agent problem, and that for a regulator is a challenge in itself. So this requires homegrown strategies for regulators in Africa, where I think the bank can help. And this is something which goes on top of the global agenda of Basel III and so forth, where Africa should adhere to. So finding the balance between global and national to balance these aspects. Then there is, of course, where the bank, I think our bank is also helping the infrastructure. It's financial infrastructure, payment systems. Mr. Executive Directors, you have regularly projects coming on your desk where the bank provides this sort of support, including this week, by the way. And then there is a fact, should the government do more than that, be a direct interventionist? You were mentioning risk aversion. Well, should the government correct for this risk aversion by taking some of the risks itself? That development banking or public development banking is back into fashion. I think picking up on what was discussed yesterday by the president and his distinguished guests, we should be cautious but agnostic about that issue, meaning that the times of the old-style Washington consensus are over. At the same time, the evidence, points towards that, state-directed credit is relatively inefficient, and the political interference remains a major issue. But there are positive stories about effective public development banking. I think this is something we should recognize also. So the role of the state is evolving this double challenge, making the systems more inclusive, but keeping stability, because stability is also an inclusiveness story. When you have a financial crisis is highly regressive, either by its direct effects on the financial system or by the fiscal costs it incurs. And this sort of watershed moment in regulation affects not only Africa, it affects the whole world. But each country has to find its own solution. In my own country, for instance, 5 years ago, you would never speak of consumer protection or financial literacy. The bank would take their part of take that under their own arms, under their marketing strategies. Now that has changed. There's been rules about financial literacy, about consumer protection. So there's this watershed moment in regulation throughout the world, and including in Africa. And it's a very interesting moment, and I think there are a lot of opportunities for our bank to provide support there.
I don't know. If you asked me 10 years ago whether financial inclusive growth is a viable business or not, I would have told you, you're crazy, you're mad. It's not. So the question is that we should actually ask ourselves is, number one, recognize that inclusive growth or financial inclusiveness to provide equitable growth is the business of everybody. I think that we should come out, and that's the first recognition. The other point is that most of people don't realize that actually financial inclusion could be a business opportunity. And this is where commercial banks, insurance companies, a lot of financial providers actually fail to realize. Now, there are many reasons, and I will come to that and link the financial regulatory framework and conducive business environment. But let me just give you some statistics. The African population is is exposed to peak up to 1.6 billion in 2030. 1.6 billion. Now, income per capita is expected to grow from 1,600 or 1,500 stands now to almost about 4,500 by 2030. Now, you also, as of this year, 80% of the Africans are without financial services. No insurance, no banking accounts, penetration is very low. Now, if you look at those statistics and those numbers, certainly there's a huge untapped potential. Just take 80% of 1.6 billion people, and if you capture just 20% of that, just 20% of that, and you tell me there's no business opportunity, then I think we have to go back to drawing board. So I wanted to clear that out. Financial inclusion as a business model could very well be a very profitable business. Now, let me come to the question of whether the stability, I think if I understand that part, so moderator, how would you prevent people, I think banks or losing money? I think that was your last question, if I understand correctly. There's a development outcome, so there's development in lending money. But the question is, if that money you have lent is not returned, I always say there's no development outcome, period. The development outcomes comes when your money that you have lent to someone is returned and you recycle that money. The ripple effect is what creates the development outcome. So as a financial institution, and let me go back to my commercial bank days on a JACE course that was mandatory for you to have a signature in commercial banks, is number one, you only answer two questions. What is the strength of your primary source of repayment? And the second question is, what's the strength of your secondary source of repayment? So for banks, there is a corporate citizenship in addition to maximizing the share value of their shareholders. But the corporate citizenship and responsibility has got limitations. And it's a function of the profits that the bank makes. And the profits are function of the credit assessment and the quality of your asset quality. If you have a good asset quality, good risk management, you get repaid all your loans, you put part of your income to public services. In essence, what they should have done is invest maybe in extending the services to remote areas. So I think the first priority as far as I'm concerned were commercial banks, and commercial banks are different role. Development financial institutions, whether at the national level or at the regional level or at the multilateral level, have got different responsibilities. But let me focus on commercial banks basically, and also more development financial institutions at the private sector level, is for you to get your money back, lend it again, get it back, lend it again. That's where the development outcome is there. So good risk assessment, strong primary source of repayment, strong secondary source of repayment. You got to have a safety net in case the first fails. That brings additional income which can be distributed to activity which can contribute to financial inclusion and other good citizen activities.
They would be working with this population. Why they're not doing it, there are a number of reasons, right? Part is lack of understanding of the business, like microfinance. We saw the tremendous growth of microfinance. After some experimented with that, and led the way, and that has in good part because of has been in good part because of the support of our institutions that have been there, joining the private sector by investing in them. In the case of IFC, strongly invest in microfinance institutions by providing technical assistance, very successful models. It has tried it in different ways, right? The most successful model now has been the holding company that invests in different companies. By introducing new instruments, there is a whole, in the case of IFC, there's a whole line of business of advisory services, the largest business line in advisory services, working on access to finance, or developing new instruments to facilitate the provision of financial services to those who otherwise would not be bankable. So there is a huge role of our institutions in supporting, on the supply side, supporting governments to strengthen their rule of law. As investors, some of us have been in that role too. We know, and by common sense, we know that stability is the first thing you require. So enforcement of contracts, enforcement of law, strong regulation, by supporting the government, by establishing, and the private sector, as IFC has done in this case, in improving the information system. To a large extent, why this system don't work is because of information asymmetry. That's a fundamental element of why it doesn't work. Credit bureaus are fundamental. That's why it works in developed countries, right? When you acquired a loan or you get a credit card in a bank, this is informed to the rest of the system, and whether you are paying or not, this is informed to the rest of the system. That does not exist in many of the countries. So knowing what's going on with those who are borrowing or those who are saving is fundamental. In 48 countries, 67% of these countries have already strategies to promote financial inclusion. On the demand side, we can also help the users by improving financial literacy. As Jean-Luc was saying a moment ago, which is critical, something that we did not see in the past. Financial literacy on the part of the user is fundamental. Now we all see it. And finally, we can help also governments and private sector by setting up consumer protection regulations. Consumer protection in the rest of our businesses are very normal. We all know about that, and countries have norms for protecting consumers in trading, right? But not in financial sector, including in the United States. It was just a result of this past crisis that an institution to protect the rights of financial users was created. So there are a number of things that we can do at institutions. And precisely that vacuum, that 80% of bank population, that's precisely what provides us a raison d'etre in a role to play in this market.
In terms of saying, how to recalibrate this sector and who are the players, and more importantly, what is the role that we have in this whole storyline and how we could be effective. So, gentlemen, we need to take pride that we have a role and we need to deliver effectively on that role. And what Caliph saw in the statistics as opportunities, Marvin says what the statistics haven't said. One of my colleagues used to say, figures hide more than they show. Bankers see risks in that figures. And how do we de-risk this statistic is what Marvin has appropriately said. And I open the floor the discussions to the floor.
We have lessons learned from the global finance system, which may be applicable to the microfinance booming also. What are those lessons learned? And second thing, I would like just to also get the viewpoint of the panelists about the microfinance institution model, which we know most of them are highly subsidized at the beginning, and also the role of NGOs in preparing the underserved so that they can be ready and graduate to become client of the financial system. I would like their viewpoint about that, because we know that these are players that are on the ground and they have had many experiences. I'm referring to the NGOs. The last point that I want to comment and ask about is this client. When we talk about private sector, we think about corporates and companies. But I used to hear many experts saying the largest private sector in the world are the farmers. So, and the potential that Mr. Mohammed Khalif was talking about the statistic, these billions of people, majority of them are farmers. And we know the ability of farmers to loan and pay back is low, because most often they borrow for the basic need, food, health, because the children is sick, going to the hospital. So about what I think Jean-Luc mentioned about the ripples, how wide is the ripple effect, knowing that these people borrow money usually not to generate income, but for basic consumption. So those are the points I would like you to elaborate. Other than that, thank you very much for this brilliant introduction of the topic.
To the point where commercial banks has they have a lot of liquidity, but they don't want to support microfinance institutions that are available in rural areas, and the question is why, you know. And then the other thing that it didn't come out clear from the discussion is, what role has infrastructure, other than the infrastructure, financial infrastructure, in advancing the development of microfinance and making microfinance more accessible and more inclusive? Thank you.
Or there may be a sector, the private sector or the arm of the bank can help it. But I think the fundamental role of the institution, evaluation of the African Development Bank, should be really to solve this critical problem we have. Otherwise, the problems are accumulating, unemployment, is growing every year. It's like really exploding. And we are a financial institution, and therefore our role should be really to address this major constraint. That's the way I see it. I think we have commercial banks in all countries. We have been lending, giving lines of credit, various national development banks. I think the role of those banks, needs to be redefined. They should play a bigger role in promoting microfinance. If they lose money, at least there should be a way to subsidize those things, in a separate activity. Or the government themselves can do it anyway. That's part of the issue. So how to do it, how organizationally, question of access, who should benefit, and so forth. As one of my colleagues said, I think African farmers are very hard-working people. But they don't have the means. They don't have the tools, really. They're toiling with their hands, bare hands. There's nothing, there's very little, let me say, if not nothing, at least very little that is going there. The investment of the bank in agriculture, I was just looking at some statistics, it's really shameful. Okay, the governments, of course, the bank doesn't do the things, but I think we should push the governments to go into agriculture. The budget of agriculture is, I think, falling or something. I mean, it's a crisis.
We certainly see a strong role on ensuring stability and improving confidence in the banking system and non-banking system as well. The question then becomes, what happens to the informal sector? Is inclusion only defined as microfinance? Is that our only instrument of choice? What functions should the government be playing in ensuring stability of the non-formal sector? Let's keep in mind that in countries like Bangladesh, where these instruments flourished, there was more self-regulation rather than government intervention and regulation. Second, the role of our institutions as development partners. What function should we be playing besides pushing governments and ensuring an enabling environment going forward? Third, the role of instruments. There is a wide range that exists. We've tried working with governments on a range of things, from mobile banking to postal savings to all of these instruments that have to some degree worked. Do we know which ones worked better than others? Mohammed mentioned technology coming in and seeing how some of these can make a difference. I don't know which one has worked well and not, and that would be interesting. Last, talking of what has worked well and not, there's some mention of indicators of success. Development outcomes. In the end, inclusion is all about development outcomes. A colleague mentioned velocity of money as a possible indicator, account penetration as a possible indicator. But these are all focused on the formal sector, and they're focused on cash as the main driver, not the non-cash instruments, not the non-banking instruments. What are the kinds of things we need to be looking at, especially as inclusive growth becomes part of our long-term strategy?
As a matter of fact, in the bank, we did some evaluations of rural financing that was channeled through rural banks, or as it were. But these were development banks, national development banks, that had failed because of governance issues, management issues, products and instruments issues. So at that time in the 80s and the 90s, we had some, yeah. And then in terms of the bank, we also are launching a microfinance, an evaluation of the microfinance and microcredit in general, and we will focus. But the most important thing is that we have channeled this microfinance or microcredit as part of our projects, as component of our projects.
Okay.
And also through microfinance institutions, and also both in public and private.
So this agenda is very high, and I think, as there's growth, there is also integrity challenges. We see some of them in West Africa currently, so there's also a role for the bank there, I'm sure, and we with the legal department, we actually work on this. The second one has to do with Rakesh's question on self-regulation. I think I didn't want to say that self-regulation is not, it remains very important. Certainly the microfinance has done really well with the non-performing loan aspect of the regulation, but as similarly there are issues with profitability or commercial viability of microfinance, and hence there the role of the state or of regulation in helping them to advance their agenda and to grow is a different one. But certainly self-regulation can work. I didn't want to convey the idea that it didn't work. It didn't work too well in the OECD countries in the past few years. That we can say, I think, with certain confidence.
Okay, very briefly, I'll try to respond to the question, the lesson learned from the microfinance and the role of the private versus the public sector. On the lessons learned, I would mention 3 lessons. The first one is microfinance is not the only solution to improve financial inclusion. I think from what transpires from the discussion we had earlier, financial inclusion requires a holistic approach. You need to work on different frontiers, the regulatory environment, supply, demand. So, and microfinance can only help. It cannot solve the financial inclusion problem. You need to provide insurance, you need to provide efficient payment systems, access to savings services, etc., etc. So that's one lesson. The second one is that the regulatory framework is key to develop a microfinance sector. We saw experience in few African countries, like, for example, Morocco, where microfinance institutions are obliged to have an NGO status, so that prevents them from raising funding, it limits their capacity to operate, and it hinders actually the development of the sector. The third lesson is that the NGO model could work to initiate or at early stage of the sector development, but on the long term, it actually hinders the role that microfinance could play in the financial inclusion agenda, because these institutions usually remain small, poorly capitalized, subsidized, they don't have professional business procedures, so it limits the role they could play. So those are the three lessons. Very briefly, private sector versus public sector. I think that the role of the public sector should not be to replace market. It should put the necessary conditions for the private sector to operate and to compete. Actually, also the public sector could encourage or oblige the private sector to collaborate on payment system, for example, to achieve economies of scale. But I would advise that the public sector stay away of trying to replace markets, missing markets. Thank you.
That when we talk about financial inclusion, we're not talking about just the base of the pyramid. It is true that when we move down it, from the income pyramid, top to bottom, the intensity of exclusion is greater at the bottom. But there are some other sectors that are being excluded as well. So the whole business is not about microfinance. It's about financing MSMEs. It's about insurance. It's not only about finance. It's about insurance. It's about payment systems, such as mobile banking that has developed. I mean, so as I said, there are 4 areas in which we should have our eyes on credit, saving, payments, and risk management products. That's the spectrum of products. And you have to consider the entire spectrum of the population and firms as well. It's not only micro. Finally, on lessons learned, we've learned a lot about micro. Soraya has spoken about this, but the experience of India, again, taught us about the importance of consumer protection. I said consumer protection based on this crisis, but in microfinance, that was a hard lesson, if you remember. Consumer protection to protect the the borrower. We learned also about the implications of more articulate and in bigger microfinance institutions that, in the context of the crisis, were also exposed to this becoming more articulate. They were also exposed to the implications of the crisis. There were no longer these NGO institutions, organizations that were isolated. They can also be exposed to macro events, shocks in the financial sector. We have learned also about the importance of these institutions to take savings, that they should work upon profitable basis, no NGO basis if you want them to be sustainable going forward or in the long term. We have learned that they are important to promote saving and to smooth out consumption. Evidence is not too conclusive about growth of firms and microfinance. And finally, there is an on-top, from the intellectual point of view and from the policy point of view, there is an on-top market and challenge that is precisely, a challenge for all of us, and it is the farmers that you pointed out. We don't know exactly how to deal with that. We haven't come up to a good solution, and we need better answers.
The spill of the time is time well spent. I thank my colleagues on the right, my left, and also those who are in the front. And I think the spillover time is well spent, and I think it will carry on to our next item, which is on the program, and I invite you all to also attend the one which is a continuation. So I thank you again for your participation.